Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining today's meeting where we will be reviewing the findings and initial recommendations for the update to the 2016 Integrated Solid Waste Management Plan for Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. My name is Corey Ann Mansell, and I'll be starting today's discussion, but of course handing it over to several of the folks that have been working on the plan to talk about these initial findings. For today's meeting, we will provide a project overview of what was asked of the updates to the 2016 plan, and then the goals for today's meeting. We will then review the findings for the disaster debris management section of the plan, then segue to talking about the renewable energy materials management section, then talking about comprehensive waste diversion activities and findings, and then have time for questions and close out at the end. Today's meeting is focused primarily on sharing our initial findings and what will be included in the plan update, but we will have time at the end for questions, and then we will also be asking for your comments and feedback along the way. You're more than welcome to use the chat feature of Zoom. And then you can also send me a direct email if you're wanting to share feedback in that way as well. If you are attending this meeting outside of your regular work hours without employer compensation, or if you require childcare stipends, you can contact me for more information. And as we noted in the beginning of this meeting, we do have Spanish translation services for today's discussion. The goal of today's meeting is to review the process for the Integrated Solid Waste Management Plan update that was prepared in 2016 and provide a high-level overview of the forthcoming plan, which has three focus areas, one being disaster debris management, renewable energy materials management, and then comprehensive waste diversion activities that will help the state meet their state diversion goals. As I mentioned, I'm Corey Ann Mansell. I'm a consultant at Resource Recycling Systems, who is RRS, who is working with CDPHE, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, to facilitate the plan update. RRS is a consulting firm with over four decades of experience. We've led the development of several many state and county solid waste management plans, and thus we are excited to support this project. I am based in Boulder, Colorado, and have some of our team based here also in Colorado. So Franny, if you could provide an introduction as well.
Sure. Hi all. Thanks for joining tonight. I'm Brady Miles. I'm an analyst with RRS. I've been with RRS for about 4 years now. I reside in Bailey, Colorado, and have been mostly working on the waste diversion aspect of the solid waste master plan. So that's what I've been doing. I'll hand it over to Travis to introduce himself.
Hey everyone, thanks for attending tonight. My name is Travis Barnes. I'm a senior consultant with RRS. My subject area of expertise on this plan is the disaster debris section, so looking forward to sharing our findings with that. And I'll hand it over to Elizabeth with the Five Lakes Energy team.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I've been with Five Lakes about 1.5 years, and I lead our industrial decarbonization team. I'll hand it to Eli.
Hi, I'm Eli Gold, also with Five Lakes Energy, and I lead our power sector team.
And we also have Bill Turley, who would introduce yourself, who has supported the project as well.
Hi, I'm Bill Turley. I was the founder and longtime executive director of the C&D Recycling Association. We handled, obviously, the bulk materials, including disaster debris, and I've been working with Travis on that section of the project.
And we'll turn it over to David, introduce himself.
Hey everybody, David Snap. I manage the Solid Waste Materials Management Program at CDPHE, and I'm overseeing this grant from the EPA and the development from CDPHE's side of things here.
And as noted on this slide, so RS is facilitating this process for that 2016, the update to the 2016 Colorado Integrated Solid Waste Management Plan. And there are three focus areas, one being looking at renewable energy sector and the end of life of those materials, that being solar panels, wind turbines, and electric vehicle batteries, and seeing what type of recycling is currently happening and what can help manage those materials in the forthcoming decade or so. And then also looking at disaster debris management, helping local governments prepare for disaster debris and managing those materials. And then also looking at comprehensive waste diversion policies and strategies to help increase overall diversion in the state. And as noted from David, it is supported by the EPA Environmental Protection Agency Solid Waste Infrastructure for Recycling SWIFR grant. Anything else to add, David?
No, I just want to thank everybody for being here tonight. And I think most people have been on one of the calls and already heard me give my speech. But we are just looking to do that 10-year update. So much has happened in the last 10 years, so much legislation and other things, and a lot of good information out there. So we're just looking to kind of do a midterm update to the plan and see where we can go for the next 10 years. And, especially with the renewable energy sector, how we could project, the needs for the state in the future on that.
Great, thank you. So the timeline shown here, we have had a series of meetings on these three topic areas focused on disaster debris, renewable energy, and waste diversion, along with Spanish interpretation provided at several, as well as in-person facilitation for the waste diversion topics. This has helped us really consolidate your input and those that attended to get their feedback on where we should be focusing our findings and compiling that information into the plan. Today's meeting is going to be a recap of those meetings and what we're intending to incorporate into the plan. And then there will be a 30-day public comment period this fall, with the intended wrap up to be the end of 2025. So there will be more opportunities to provide your feedback, and we definitely encourage you to do so, in addition to the discussion we'll have later this evening. All right, Travis, over to you to talk about disaster debris.
All right, I'll go ahead and get us started on the disaster debris. So essentially, we had the stakeholder meetings that Corey just went over on the timeline. And as part of our effort, we're also going to be, beyond just making recommendations to the state, providing a planning template that will be assisting local governments. So next slide, please. So let's just set the stage a little bit about why it's so important to plan for disaster preparedness. The graph on the right is from NOAA, and it just shows over the past several decades the increasing frequency of major declared disasters and the capital outlay associated with that. I think a key takeaway here is that no community is not under threat to a certain extent. And the second bullet there, 90% of U.S. counties experienced a declared disaster from 2011 to 2022. So it just speaks to the importance that communities really do need to be thinking through how would they respond to a significant debris generating event. And in particular, this year, there's been two recent executive orders that have come out of the Trump administration, and they've indicated that there's going to be changes at FEMA and potentially more responsibility flowing to the states and to local jurisdictions as opposed to the federal government. And so it's very timely that the state was proactive to undertake this effort and really make this a priority. And we're going to cover on the next slide some of the feedback that we received from the communities that participated in the stakeholder sessions. Next slide, please. So some of the feedback that we got was pretty consistent across the different workshops that we held. I think the key takeaway is that there are some communities that are not very well prepared right now, meaning that they don't have disaster debris management plans in place, or they have plans that haven't been updated in recent history and are kind of outdated. There was also a lot of feedback, particularly from some of the more rural and underpopulated and potentially less resourced communities, that their staff wear a lot of hats. They have a lot of responsibility already doing core services and their core work, and the debris management aspect of things or disaster preparedness is somewhat of a an other duty as assigned. And so it's really important for those jurisdictions to increase the collaboration across the different departments within their community, because there's the solid waste department might be touching a little bit about how waste is handled, whereas maybe their emergency or sheriff's department, some communities are focused more on emergency preparedness and action right after an event. And so increasing that collaboration was something that that came out as a need. There was also good feedback that people were very appreciative that the state was making this a priority and that we're going to be providing some additional guidance and resources. So we think the planning template that we'll be providing as part of this project will be well received and appreciated by those communities. We also saw that many communities do not have debris management sites already set up in place. So for those on the call that might not know, these are typically parcels or facilities where a jurisdiction is already identified where they are temporarily take debris after a major disaster to stage it, so then it can then be handled and efficiently either disposed of or recycling depending on the type of the material that's generated. If your community does not have a site already identified and a game plan of how you utilize that, that's just an additional step that you have to take before you can really start your debris removal operation in earnest. So it just means that you're starting even further delayed, and then trying to, pick a site and, put debris there can be contentious in the middle of an emergency response when tensions are kind of high and everyone's stressed out, obviously trying to get their lives and back together. And so people need to be proactive, or jurisdictions rather, in picking a spot, making sure they know how to utilize that spot and how they would, make sure they can get heavy truck traffic in and out, where they would store materials on site, that type of thing. There was also a voice need for clear guidance on, who's responsible for managing those sites and permitting those sites. So in Colorado, it is the local government, whether you're a city or a county's responsibility to permit those within your jurisdiction. And there was some uncertainty as to what the state's role is versus what local government's role is, particularly in some of the smaller communities. There's also some questions regarding soil testing requirements. So some states require, before you activate a debris management site, if you're going to be storing, we'll say, non-vegetative debris, so stuff from either a fire or a flood, that you have to test the soil before you put that debris on the site, and then you test the soil after to make sure there was no leaching of any materials into the soil. And if there was testing showing that did occur, then you have to remediate that effort. So there were some questions about, is that local government, should they be doing that as part of their permitting process, or is it something the state regulates? And then in general, just concerns about regulatory compliance, not knowing exactly what to do. And so for some of these communities where disaster response isn't their primary job obligation, in the middle of a response when they may have been impacted with their friends and family or their own home, and then they don't really know how to respond, we need to have these questions kind of already spelled out for them well in advance. That way there's no guessing when it comes to what they're supposed to do in an actual emergency situation. There were some examples of successful waste diversion from recent disasters that did occur, particularly with the Marshall Fire. Some jurisdictions had pretty good success in running different collection routes to keep that material out of the landfill. And that really gets back to the need to source separate material at the curb and to properly communicate that to residents as well. So tell them, how to place their debris out, what pile to do it, when collections will occur. All of that is extremely important to make sure people comply with what the local government is asking them to do. And the more participation and compliance you get with that, the higher chance you have to recover some of those items and keep them out of the landfill. In particular, white goods and scrap metal are more easily to target. And in general, the more commingled your debris is, the more mixed together that it is, the harder it is to actually get that material diverted away from the landfill. A lot of it does end up going to disposal, unfortunately. There was also some feedback from communities that they did not have their pre-positioned contracts in place. So typically best practice for local governments would be to have an outside contractor doing the debris collection and hauling if your community is overwhelmed. So if you get a significant disaster that is something that your local resources can't do by yourself, you can have these contracts in place. They normally don't cost you anything except the time to procure them, and then you activate them when there is a declared disaster, and then they bring in the heavy equipment, all of the hauling trucks, and the labor to assist with the recovery response, as well as their expertise, because these companies do this all over the country, responding from one disaster to the next, and they use a network of subcontractors to make sure they can get that equipment to you quickly and reliably. There's also debris monitoring contracts, which are consultants that typically are tracking all of the dollars and expenditures that occur with that. They're making sure the material that's put out for collection is eligible for collection. They're tracking where material was flowing to those debris management sites we talked about, and then ultimately where it ends up going for disposal or for recycling. And so if a community does not have those contracts in place and they are hit with something that's a significant disaster that overwhelms them, they're kind of starting from, ground zero with having to procure that outside help under a lot of duress, and that's just not a best practice. So having those pre-positioned contracts is really essential. And we did hear from some communities they don't have them or their contracts are outdated. To aid in that, they requested assistance for, example requests for proposals or scopes of work that could help them procure that, as well as just, sharing best practices, what communities have recent contracts that are being used and, how they've been procured. Just sharing that information from municipality to municipality was something that was voiced as a need. And then we also heard some examples of communities that thought they had their contracts in place, but when they were actually hit with the disaster, the Marshall Fire, and were going to stand up those contracts, they realized that they were outdated and didn't meet the current FEMA procurement guidelines. And so they had to stop in the middle of their operation and go back out and procure contracts again. So it just speaks to the need of making sure that you've got everything lined up in advance of when a disaster would strike is best practice. And just because you have it there, make sure that you're looking at it every year, dusting it off to make sure that it's current and that everything is still in good order. Next slide, please. So as part of the debris management planning template that we'll be providing, it provides a good overview of the types of information that a local jurisdiction should include with their plan, including background information specific to their community that will aid in the response. It should also help identify the roles and responsibilities of the internal staff, so specific departments and specific staff, or at least their positions as to who's doing what, as well as identifying what the outside contractors would be doing in a very detailed manner. There's also a need for debris forecasting and scenario planning. Essentially, that is somewhat of a role-playing exercise to identify, what's the most common threat to a particular community, where would debris most likely be generated within the community. So for instance, if there's a river that runs through your community and it might be prone to flooding, where in the flood zone would that debris potentially accumulate, and be thinking through how you would collect it. There's also some guidance we're providing on steps that communities can take to prevent debris from occurring in the first place as best as possible, as well as a bulk of information on actually the removal process and the collection process. Additional information about those debris management sites that I mentioned and considerations that they should be taken into account. And then also, how do you close out debris response operation, and to make sure that you are, I'm getting feedback that I need to talk a little bit slower for interpretation, so I'll try to do that. Sorry. Also the reporting requirements of that, and then the lessons learned. So if your community is unfortunately hit with a disaster, it's very important for those staff to capture those lessons learned, because over time there is turnover and people retire and so forth, and hopefully people aren't hit with a disaster every year. And so if it's one of those things where it was 4 or 5 years ago and you didn't do a good job of kind of capturing those lessons learned, then you're missing an opportunity to make sure your community's set up for a better response next time. The template also includes a debris management operations checklist. So that's kind of a quick thing for your operations teams to run down, to be thinking proactively about what you can do in advance of a disaster event, to be putting yourself on good footing to respond in the future. Next slide, please, Corey. So out of our process, we developed 9 recommendations that are included in the draft plan currently. I'm not going to go through each of these and read them right now because I've got a slide that I'll touch on each of these. I think the key thing is that we looked at things from general awareness and things the state could do better that they're already doing to just enhance it or to make people or communities more aware of the steps they're already doing, to some more aggressive policy recommendations that would actually recommend amendments to some of the state acts and that would have more kind of enforcement capabilities as well and would be potentially more expensive for local governments to comply with. And I'll cover each of these in the next slides for you. So the first recommendation was to develop a guidance document to improve either the web page or to provide more clarity to local governments regarding the regulatory and permitting considerations. So not to pick on the state, there's a lot of good information contained on various web pages across the state agencies, but not kind of one place where everything is put there together that has been updated. That's a screenshot from one of the pages right now, and it still has a lot of information for 2022 as an example. So this is one of the ones that's a little bit easier for the state to achieve, but the whole idea is to gather all the relevant information, put it in one place and make sure that everyone's aware of where that place is at to make it easier for those local jurisdictions when they are looking for information to kind of get it right at their fingertips and really just make it more accessible to them. Next slide, please, Corey. The second one is to amend the Colorado Disaster Emergency Act to require debris management planning. This one would be obviously take a lot more work to get that done, although we do think it would be one of the more impactful steps that the state could take to really make sure that jurisdictions are prioritizing disaster preparedness. The law already requires counties and municipalities to participate in emergency management agencies and to update emergency plans, but notably, it does not require those plans to discuss debris management in particular or debris management sites. And so that's a gap where the plan could be, I mean, the act could be amended to require that, to specifically call out what local governments are supposed to be doing with that. Tennessee is one of the states that does that. And then also, it was voiced that that would be viewed as, somewhat of an unfunded government mandate should the state move in that direction. And some of the jurisdictions that were on the calls were stating that, funding is very tight, staff is very tight. And so they would be appreciative if there is funding for the state to help support that in some way, whether that be through a grant process or something else to help those communities make sure they would have the resources to properly develop the plans if that was a requirement. But again, this is one of those things where the state has an act already in place. It is encouraging those communities or requiring them rather to have some level of readiness with emergency plans. But again, it does not specifically call out the debris, which is a major shortcoming of the existing act. Next slide, please, Corey. The third recommendation would be to amend the act to require disaster debris management sites, or to also develop a statewide permitting program whereby the state would take over ownership of that permitting away from the local jurisdictions to try to make sure there's more standardization of how those sites are identified and how they're regulated. There is a precedent for that in some of the other states that we researched. Virginia and Florida in particular have a process in place where local governments are encouraged to identify where they'll take debris and have those sites pre-authorized by the state. And there's some guidelines the state provides as to where those sites can be located within certain setbacks from, say, water bodies and wetlands and things like that. This would be something that would require potentially local governments to acquire land or to use land that they already have for other purposes to designate it as a debris site. So that could be, again, viewed as, additional mandate by the state that local governments have to do that they might not be prepared for. We will say in practice across the country, states do identify, or excuse me, jurisdictions do identify things such as parks and recreation space. Other solid waste facilities can be co-located with these. Some vacant parcels that are planned for future things can be used. And some communities even use private land under contract to store debris as well. So there's a variety of ways to get there, but the recommendation would be that the state, require local jurisdictions to have at least one site identified in advance. of that, and then to look at, again, taking over the permitting process of that. And if that's not feasible, then at a minimum, the state can provide better guidance on what their role is versus what the local government's role is. And that's all covered in our plan update recommendations and the narrative as well. Next slide, Corey. The fourth recommendation was to improve awareness of and access to recycling opportunities there. When a local government is hit with a disaster, again, everyone's thinking quickly on, safety first. How do you get people back to normal as quickly as you can? And so the urgency to get debris removed is really paramount over trying to recycle at that point in time. Unless governments have strong sustainability policies already in place, whatever's going to get the debris picked up as quickly and safely as possible is kind of what takes the priority in that. And so local governments can do their part by trying to identify facilities in their local jurisdiction or within their haul distance where they could take material to be recycled or beneficially used in some way, if it's vegetative debris as an example. And so we're encouraging those jurisdictions to go ahead and to look for facilities, engage with them, figure out, one, would they be willing to take, an abundance of material that might surge in terms of the volume that they would take after a disaster event? What would that look like? What would the tipping fees be? Work with their procurement departments to identify, do they need to have pre-positioned contracts to reserve some capacity at those facilities, for example? The state, Colorado, already has a registered recyclers webpage. And on that, local governments can go and find their county and look for facilities where you could, recycle some items like, say, scrap metal and white goods as an example. The EPA has a great tool. That's the disaster recovery tool that actually has, I think, over 20,000 facilities across the country listed that can accept different types of debris. And so this could be something the state could emulate, where they basically take that tool and recreate it for Colorado with a little more nuance specific to maybe the regions in Colorado, to make it easier and more accessible for local governments to kind of proactively engage with these different facilities and identify potential end markets where they could take material if they are hit with a disaster. That way it's not an afterthought, but it's something they're planning in advance for. Next slide, please. This recommendation was about training and making sure that people are participating in the training that's already out there. So the Colorado Local Technical Assistance Program was offering 2 FEMA-supported online debris management courses, but as of May of this year, FEMA has retired them, and we don't yet know whether they will be or to what extent they'll be supporting those types of training moving forward. And so that creates an opportunity for the state to step up to provide some additional training opportunities. And that's something where the Department of Public Health and Environment could assist other sister agencies with developing some training to really focus on debris management in particular, and not all of the other aspects that come with emergency response. And to standardize that training, make it more frequent, make it where there's maybe an annual training calendar that people know in advance on how to participate, and that way it would hopefully increase participation and get local government staff kind of more engaged on the topic, as well as just aware of the opportunities that are there, so that they can start to learn more about it and share those best practices across jurisdictions. Next slide, Corey. There's also a recommendation to enhance public awareness about debris management operations. And so I'm based in the Tampa, Florida area, and obviously we're under threat from hurricanes every year. And so a lot of jurisdictions down here have really been taking efforts to kind of train the public, for lack of a better word, by sending out information, getting that into their thought about, if we are hit with something significant, what is their role to play and how can they best help their community get back on its feet. And so that's something where Colorado has had some recent fires that are very memorable to folks in recent history, but maybe hasn't been as impacted as, say, California and Florida and some of the other states that have had major disasters recently. Some examples that we found were in New Jersey. They have a speed up your cleanup flyer that they distribute that's got good information. California has a great tool, the Recovery Guide to Wildfire Debris Removal, which would be something that Colorado could look to emulate. And then we did find some local examples. Grand County, Colorado has a flood ready brochure. So it's just, creating some materials that are more for the public to consume to get them to think about how they would need to participate in, putting debris out at the curb, how to segregate materials to increase the availability of recycling, and just to kind of increase their overall awareness about what the process looks like if their community is negatively impacted with a disaster. And next slide. Contracting assistance was something that was also mentioned as a need, as we discussed earlier. And so one of the recommendations is to look for ways to increase the ability of the state to help local governments meet those FEMA procurement guidelines. California, as an example, has a database of contractors that are approved to work within certain regions. It makes it easy for local governments to kind of identify contractors the state has already vetted in that way. Other jurisdictions, such as New Jersey, have a contract in place where if your local government doesn't have one of their own, which is best practice to have, that you can kind of piggyback on the state contract in that moment of need. If you have an urgent disaster need and you don't have a contract in place, or maybe your contract was outdated, or you find that it didn't meet for FEMA guidelines for whatever reason because it was procured not in the recent history, something like that. So those are other examples, and we cover those in greater detail in the narrative. Florida has made a new program just the past couple of years that's probably one of the more robust ones in the entire country, and rightfully so given the hurricane threat that I mentioned. But it's called Florida's Recovery Obligation Calculation. And in this, it's an application program where local governments apply for assistance via the state, and the state actually holds their hand through the entire process of looking at all of their different documentation, their plans, their contracts, and they provide them a score of how ready they are as part of a standardization of looking at that, and that pre-authorizes them to receive a portion of public assistance funding in advance of when they would normally get it from FEMA. And FEMA has appreciated the state has done this because it really has helped cut through on a lot of the uncertainty on what the federal government's role is versus the state government versus the local government's role with that. And so that one did require the state to have new staff to stand that up. And they are increasingly staffing that agency up at the state level as they grow with more participation in that. I think as of my last discussion with them, they only had about 300 of the jurisdictions within Florida. So still a long ways to go there, a new program, but very robust engagement with the local communities, and they're sharing the information they're learning and where the gaps are with other communities that aren't yet participating. So that's kind of, I guess, emerging best practice that the state could look at as well. And next slide. Another recommendation is to encourage policies or to incentivize development that actually helps to minimize debris generation in the first place. So the EPA came out with a great resource just earlier this year in June. It's creating disaster resilient buildings to minimize disaster debris. So local governments could, via their ordinances, start to encourage the development of buildings that are more resilient and that are more able to withstand, whether it be high winds or flooding or fires potentially, and to help minimize the amount of debris that is generated and minimize the damage and help the community get back on its feet quicker. So that's something where local governments, if they're investing public taxpayers' dollars in public facilities, they could look to potentially harden those facilities and to make them more resilient, and so that those dollars go further and hopefully help reduce the amount of debris, but also help maintain some of the public services and whatnot that those buildings provide to the community in the aftermath of a disaster. As an example, down here in Florida, many jurisdictions now require public facilities over a certain size to meet, a Cat 4 hurricane example or a Cat 5, depending on the jurisdiction that you're at. So Colorado could look to do that to help mitigate future impacts from wildfires and flooding. And next slide. And the last recommendation on the debris section would be that the state just continue to assist local governments in prioritizing disaster debris management. There was a lot of feedback from the stakeholders that they were appreciative the state was proactive on this, that they also felt that there was a need. And so we'd recommend that the state not just look at this being a one and done type effort, but that with future updates to the solid waste management plan, that they continue to include debris management, and that they continue to advocate that local governments, if they're doing solid waste management plans, to also have potentially a debris management component of that. There's a lot of existing planning frameworks that local governments do that could be, slightly modified to increase the priority of debris. So whether you got an emergency management plan or a solid waste management plan, those don't always speak specifically to how you would manage the debris from a disaster. And that's a shortcoming where you could use those existing planning frameworks to make sure that it's continued to be prioritized. And again, within our plan update, we've got a lot more detail on that, and we can have some time for questions at the end. So I'll pass it over to Elizabeth or Eli with the renewable energy management section.
Yeah, I think I'm going to start us off with a little bit of level setting, just presenting the kind of modeling portion and some of the final numbers we came out with. To keep things tight, I just put together kind of 2 brief slides with a few numbers in them. And then I'll pass it off to Elizabeth, who's going to dig more into the policy recommendations. So next slide. So, I mean, I think the basic thing that I want to present here is really just the very substantial volumes that we will be expecting, from renewable energy and EV batteries over the next really 30 years is what we modeled. And any type of modeling exercise that gets a little bit less reliable the further out you get from the date. But the main point is that, especially with the wind and solar debris, or end of life recycling needs and disposal, is that there's a lot that's already installed, and all of that is going to have to come offline over the next 20 to 30 years. So, and then I broke it out here. So what you can see here is, short tons, and this is aggregate short tons. So by the time we reach 2040, we're expecting, we're expecting Colorado to have retired around 600,000 short tons of wind installations. Now, I've broken that out into turbine blades, which is really the hardest part to dispose of. And that's only, about 20 or less percent of that aggregate. The rest is, steel and other components that are more easily recyclable. And the same with solar installations, because they started being installed much later. By 2040, the aggregate installations is substantially less, in that kind of 70,000 short ton range, but it grows substantially by the end of time. By 2055. But again, only a portion of that is modules. About half of it in the case of solar installations. And then EV batteries are really become very, very substantial as EVs ramp up as a portion of vehicles sold. The modeling on this was performed, based on some modeling of future growth that may or may not be 100% accurate for EVs, especially as things may be getting a little more difficult soon. But it's going to be substantial one way or the other. So next slide. And this is just the same data, but in graph form. And I think the main thing to see here is that the wind issue becomes substantial much sooner than the solar. Partially, wind has shorter lifetimes, and also there was a lot of wind deployment much earlier than solar. And then batteries are gonna ramp up over time, and solar is also going to become more and more substantial as time goes on. And I think that is really all I have to present. So I'll pass it off to Elizabeth.
All right, so there were 3 things we were interested in terms of looking at policy options. One was really, how do you keep these materials out of landfill? The next was, how do you open up second life opportunities? And then the last was, how do you promote recycling? So we start just by talking about solar panels and thinking about diversion from landfill and recycling options. Where we're at right now is essentially our text for the update to the ISWMP has a lot of narrative behind the policy recommendations that explores different states and the approaches that they have taken, as well as the EU, what worked, what didn't work. And so as a result, the sections that we have here that have, for example, several different options for addressing something like keeping solar panels out of landfill, are sort of reflecting that, the fact that there are different options. And we're still, I think, exploring with David whether or not he wants these prioritized in alternative to how they're currently drafted in our report text. So along those lines, one way to keep solar photovoltaic panels. So when we think about the installation overall, there are other components, as Eli mentioned, that are actually readily recyclable. And they're not an issue when it comes to landfill and solar arrays, because the aluminum framing, for example, or racking, can just be recycled by metal scrappers. So that's a system that's already in place. So the real challenge is actually the solar panel itself, or the PV panel. So different options for keeping the solar panel out of landfill would include, for example, enacting just a simple landfill prohibition on solar PV, or revising existing rules to classify solar panels as an electronic, because Colorado already has a landfill prohibition on electronics. Alternatively, there is a designation for types of waste, hazardous waste in particular, called universal waste. That is one opportunity potentially to restrict solar from landfill, because most municipal landfills can't accept hazardous waste. I guess all of them. There's just one hazardous waste accepting landfill in Colorado. So one option as a result could be to adopt this universal waste designation for solar photovoltaics. So there's a note here that thinking back to the disaster debris that we just heard about, that there are points in time when something like a terrible hailstorm or some other event could take out an entire solar field and require immediate attention. And so the notion that it might be important to enact an explicit landfill prohibition to, in general, keep solar panels out of Colorado landfill, that maybe there should also be sort of an exclusion for, or an exception for those moments when there is some sort of disaster and large volumes from one specific solar array might need to be landfilled to help clean up from that disaster. So in addition to those explicit options for keeping solar out of landfill, there are other alternatives that actually, instead of just mandating that you can't put the solar in landfill, instead essentially say you've got to recycle it. So it's an alternative approach that either incentivizes or supports or requires recycling. So as a result, the solar wouldn't be landfill. So in that context, these would essentially be alternative. There could also be opportunity to enact both in parallel. But one option would be to require the submission of an appropriate decommissioning plan that includes financial assurance and commitments to solar recycling, just to receive the project interconnect agreement or the local 1041 permit. So essentially, when a developer plans to develop a solar farm, to then take that solar farm and tie it into the power grid, there's an interconnect agreement. And so to receive that agreement, there could be a requirement that financial assurance. So how will the developer cover the end of life and the recycling of the solar, as well as committing to recycling the panels themselves, just to receive that agreement. The alternative would be the local 1041 permit, which in Colorado has to do with essentially how different locations are permitted for different uses. So for a solar developer to receive a permit to develop an area for a solar farm, potentially could have to say that the solar would be recycled at end of life to get that 1041 permit. Another option, because that really just addresses the large scale solar farm. So things like utility level, but there's also solar on homes and there's solar in community solar gardens. So to deal with the panels that could be coming out of those types of projects, another option would be to attach a small point of sale fee to solar panels sold into the residential or community projects. And then the revenue from that fee could be used to fund education programming, and distributed collection sites. So the education programming, for example, would be to create something like the types of flyers Travis mentioned, so that there were resources available for folks to understand how to recycle solar, why it's important, where to take it, and then also to fund the distributed collection sites so that they can be staffed, that they're, appropriately permitted for this. And then at those sites, then when, a homeowner has a solar panel that has broken or is at end of life, they take it to recycle. Then when they take that one panel in, there would, at that point in time, which, as we saw with what Eli showed in terms of projections, could be 30 or 40 years from now, that then they would pay an on-site market-based recycling fee at the time the panel was surrendered. So essentially, those two options would complement each other and cover everything from small and medium to large-scale projects. Another option would be to leverage the existing infrastructure for solar collection, or to support solar collection by leveraging existing infrastructure. So we heard concern that there are a lot of like municipal landfill sites or recycling sites essentially don't have a ton of staff to accommodate something like adding an entire solar collection program. So how can you leverage other types of sites that already exist in the state to support something like solar recycling without overburdening some of those existing facilities? Options could be to include, for example, solar retailers. So they already sell the panels, they're familiar with handling them. They could be also permitted to receive them and hold on to them as aggregators to then divert them to recycling. Other alternatives would be electronics recyclers. There are already many of those operating in the state. Like I mentioned, municipal landfills, and possibly material recovery facilities, so other recyclers operating in the state. Next slide. All right, so that dealt with activity going on and the dog's excited. So that dealt with keeping solar panels out of landfill and promoting recycling. But many solar panels at the end of their first life are actually still viable for other applications. So over the first 30 years of being installed out in a field with the sun shining on them, by the end of those 30 years, they can still produce about 80% as much power as when they were initially installed. So those are good panels to perhaps take, and maybe they come from a utility scale project and sell off into a secondary project, like putting on a school by selecting the ones that still work. So that's a second life opportunity. So part of our charge was to also look at how to promote those second life opportunities. There are various challenges as to why many solar panels now aren't moving from their first life into second life. So the idea is, what are the barriers and what policies could help Colorado, especially in the future, when we think about the projections we saw from Eli's forecasting, to move larger fractions of solar panels that could still have very good power production ability into second life. So one option would be for the state to ask for a new, less restrictive standard. The existing standard that is used to essentially validate solar panels when they're decommissioned to see if they still work well enough to be used again. That standard's called UL 1703. So the state could ask for a new standard versus UL 1703 to be developed that would perhaps be specific to certain project sizes. So maybe small and medium or large to support these sorts of interests. And if it were a specific interest like utility scale adoption of second life solar, then that standard request could be tailored. So the notion is that UL is Underwriters Laboratories, and they're actually responsive to requests for new types of standards, and they will develop them so that then states and recyclers can actually adopt and utilize them for things like testing and validation procedures. Another option would be to mandate solar panel labeling by chemistry type. So there are several different types of solar panels in the market right now, and many of them look the same, even though they might have slightly different chemical constituents inside. And that actually causes some challenges in terms of aggregating and moving to second life operations because they don't actually behave entirely the same. So mandating labeling on the panels could help streamline aggregation processes, whether the panels are going to recycling or second life activities that involve aggregators or other types of solar panel handlers. All right, next slide. All right, now taking a look at wind. So as Eli mentioned, wind turbines, the majority of the structure is actually made of materials that are relatively recyclable. So there's only, I believe he said, about 20% of the weight that's the wind blades, and that's the part that's hard to recycle today with current technologies. So unlike in solar, where it's about 50% of the weight. So most of the challenge with the end of life for wind turbine structures is actually keeping the blades out of landfill and not the rest of the materials, because it's mostly metal, and that's already quite valuable in the scrapping and metal recycling industry. So starting with diversion from landfill and opening up the recycling markets. So similar to solar, there are options for explicit landfill prohibitions. One would just be to enact a landfill prohibition on wind blades. Some states have pursued this. Another, to ensure that any form of a landfill prohibition would include the exceptions for natural disasters, similar to solar, right? If there's a bunch of wind blades that are too damaged because of a storm, don't want them collecting in a field. Okay, so another option would be, again, to essentially promote recycling as opposed to just mandating landfill prohibition. So in that case, requiring the submission of an appropriate decommissioning plan, similar to solar, that would include financial assurance and a commitment to wind blade recycling to receive that interconnect agreement, again, similar to solar, or the local 1041 permit. And then tacking on to that, the option to use a fee-based structure, perhaps from that permitting process. So a fee could be charged to receive the permit, and that fee-based structure could then be used to run, for example, a state-run or state-funded blade yard. So a blade yard would essentially be a location that was zoned to receive blades at their end of life and then collect them until a recycler could come in person to mechanically downsize them into like mulched material that can then be used for other applications. So that fee-based structure could also pay to bring wind blade recyclers to that blade yard several times per year, whenever needed, because enough blades might have collected there to then process them on site and then ship that mulched material off-site to where it might be further recycled into new products. So there, while we didn't hear that abandoned wind blades are an extensive problem in Colorado, it is definitely something people are concerned about, and there are at least a handful of sites where this is known to be a challenge. So this fee-based structure would also open up an opportunity to use this type of program to potentially fund retrieving the already abandoned wind blades from those handful of properties and bringing them to this type of site for processing and recycling. So the that mulched material, when you take a wind blade and shred it down, can actually be used for a variety of different applications depending on how it's processed. So in some cases, there are places that are taking it and actually using it as filler in concrete. And then in others, they're actually processing it and then using it as a cement additive that also goes into the concrete product. So interestingly, Colorado has a few additional policy pathways thinking about those mechanisms for using that mechanically downsized wind blade material that could help spur demand for the recycled wind blade material to use it in those new markets. One would be to explore opportunities to revise the existing pavement standards to accommodate cement or concrete formulated with processed wind blade materials. So every state has a Department of Transportation, and that DOT creates the standards for pavement and sometimes concrete formulations within that state. That's because every state has different weather patterns. And so the type of concrete pavement that works well in one state may not work well in another state. So there are some options there to look at something like either the concrete or asphalt standards used by the DOT and road materials in particular. And also Colorado has Buy Clean legislation, and there's opportunity to leverage that Buy Clean legislation because road projects are managed by state agencies to procure preferentially either cement or concrete that has been partially produced with recycled wind blade material. So that would give an option for Colorado to actually be its own off-taker of its own recycled wind blades. All right, next slide. Okay, so second life in this case is in solar, thinking about how do you give the solar panels second life. But with wind turbines, the blades themselves, the reason they're taken offline often is because they're mechanically damaged. So they're actually not functional to continue to use in a wind turbine structure. So most of the rest of the tower is actually still usable. All of the metal components might be perfectly fine when this happens. So the second life here is really associated with all the rest of the tower structure and not the wind blades. And to promote that second life, essentially would be trying to find new opportunities for Colorado to incentivize when a wind project developer decides to either partially rebuild or fully rebuild an entire wind project, also called repowering, to incentivize them to keep the tower structure and most of the mechanical elements like the gears and the shafts, and instead to only replace the wind blades. And that's partial repowering, so giving second life to the tower structure. So a policy option to support that would be to adopt some combination of revisions to permitting mechanisms, siting regulations, or interconnection processes that are in conjunction with tailored state tax credits to provide necessary financial support. So essentially what we heard from stakeholders who are on the development side is that it's one thing to require essentially to say, we'll give preference to wind projects if you reuse the tower structure, but sometimes that can actually be potentially more costly, cumbersome. It can have issues from a financing perspective. So the notion is that it can be really helpful to further incentivize that requirement if a state also offers tax credits that helps with the financial aspects of keeping that site going. Okay, next slide. All right, switching over to EV batteries. So again, starting off with how do you keep them out of landfill and how do you promote recycling? So in general, with all the discussion we had, we're not entirely sure that EV batteries ending up in Colorado landfill are actually a major challenge right now. It sounds like they are sometimes showing up at facilities, but in general, the bigger issue is probably occasionally they're catching fire places, which is a slightly different concern. But again, a simple landfill prohibition could be enough to ensure that any EV battery of any chemistry, and that matters because there are new chemistries that will be coming out in the future that are not really in the market right now, but that any EV battery would not be allowed in landfill. One of the reasons that might be important is just, we heard from Travis that there's some opportunities in state websites to update information. But also right now, EV batteries really aren't addressed. And so there is perhaps a gap that could be leading to confusion on some people's part. And they might actually be trying, or in the future, when there are more EV batteries around, might try to bring those to landfill, not recognizing that technically they shouldn't be there. All right, so other options to divert EV batteries from landfill would essentially be by mandating or promoting recycling. Example could be to implement a battery stewardship program specific to large format batteries. So Colorado, working through the legislature this year, there was already this type of program, a bill relevant to small and medium format batteries. So this would be specific to large format. Other states have looked into this as well. That this should include all EV battery chemistries, and that this type of program would then require battery manufacturers selling into the EV fleet in Colorado. So whoever, thinking like Kia and Hyundai and Ford, right? All the companies that are selling EVs in Colorado, that the battery suppliers going into those cars would then have to develop and register end-of-life management plans for those batteries. or it could be tied to the actual companies themselves. Now, in addition to that, adding a fee structure could help cover costs associated with managing the collection and aggregation sites, orphaned EV batteries or damaged EV batteries. So right now, Colorado has multiple mechanisms by which EV batteries when they're retired from the vehicle at their initial end of life, there's still about 80% charge capacity. So they're still actually really useful for other second life applications. And so some of them are taken out in like dealers that, like the brand name automotive dealer, that if you take your car back in for service and your EV battery is underperforming, they can remove it, replace it. And in that case, the batteries just go back through the parent companies. But there are other smaller repair shops that have started up that they actually will repair batteries and reinstall them back into cars. So this comment about adding a fee structure to help cover costs with managing collection and aggregation sites is actually more tied to all of the batteries that don't go back to recyclers through the automotive brand name companies, but through all these other smaller shops that might actually be rebuilding batteries, or for example, if a car is totaled and gets hauled to a scrapping facility, that they might be collecting batteries there as well. So there's another opportunity to potentially adopt the universal waste designation from EPA, or to declare or to establish its own guidelines within Colorado, and essentially then to classify EV batteries as universal waste, which would keep them again out of municipal landfill, but not necessarily Colorado's hazardous waste landfill. And lastly, to implement a separate requirement for the supplier or producer of the batteries that enter Colorado through business-to-business arrangements. So it'd be things like, we think of EV batteries as mostly going into cars, EVs, but that's not always the case. Some EV batteries are actually being purchased in bulk for things like grid storage projects. So in that case, they're not going to individuals like you or I. When we buy an EV and drive our car, they're going from one business to another business. So a separate option to deal with those sorts of batteries would be a requirement that essentially, when those projects are planned, that they are providing product end-of-life plans up front at the point of installation or sale, to be able to be granted approval to receive those batteries and build that project. All right, next slide. Okay, so continuing in the theme of recycling EV batteries. Again, right now, some of the batteries that come out of EVs in Colorado go back to recycling by going through the brand name automotive company, and others go through something like small battery rebuilders. So one question is, how do you effectively incentivize to make sure as many batteries as possible are coming back and not ending up scrapped somewhere? So some of those batteries are diverted immediately to recycling facilities, even though they might still have 80% charge capacity. So they could be better used in other contexts. And, others really do have enough dead cells that they are essentially better off going to recycler. But something like introducing an EV battery deposit scheme would ensure that the batteries come back, because people would want their money back. And also could give enough funding to recyclers and rebuilders, not just to cover the costs of transporting EV batteries to sites to open them up, take out the dead cells and replace them, etc., because they're heavy, so they can cost a lot to transport. But also, one of the real concerns is that not now, the current EV batteries in the market actually have a lot of high value metals in them. But in the future, when things like sodium ion batteries come online and they have less metal content that is of value, that they might actually have a negative commodity value, and hence recyclers wouldn't have the same incentive to want to purchase them, to recycle them, to reclaim those metals. So the notion of a deposit scheme in that case could be sufficient to help further incentivize recyclers in the future to want to take sodium ion batteries, for example. Even though they might not profit directly off the metal content, they would still make money from a deposit scheme. Something else that we heard was mandating battery declarations of both critical and toxic minerals and potential recycling information. And that declaration being on the battery pack that could further support safe handling, whether it's for recycling or thinking about all the different types of aggregators that are already involved in Colorado's battery recycling system. And that, oh, right. So one of the key issues is that all these different battery chemistries and brands tend to look alike. They just look like big battery boxes, and then even very trained recyclers can't always distinguish between them. So something like a declaration of the content on the battery pack could help everyone along the way in terms of safe handling practices. Next slide. Okay, promoting second life. EV batteries, as I mentioned, still have something like 80% of their capacity on average when they're first pulled out of an electric vehicle, which means they may not be great for maintaining your long driving ranges in your EV. They could still be really good for use as a backup battery storage system in a house, for example. So to promote second life opportunities for the EV batteries that are coming out of cars in Colorado to stay in Colorado in second life applications. Again, the state could request a new testing and validation standard. So similar to the comment earlier from Underwriters Laboratories, and that this new standard might have a greater emphasis on battery performance criteria over lifetime history. So right now, the standard very heavily emphasizes lifetime history to understand essentially how the battery was stored and maintained. And in some cases, that may not be fully necessary for the second life application, that may be just fundamentally understanding the performance of the battery now, and that its entire lifetime could be sufficient to validate it for a second life application. So this approach could help lower the barrier to battery repurposing. Another interesting option could be to form new public-private partnerships with the vehicle OEMs. Those are original equipment manufacturers. So like, again, Kia, Ford, GM. That these partnerships, trying to remember, I think it was Nissan who advertises having this type of approach where they insure from their own fleet. So when one of their vehicles comes back through one of their repair shops at one of their dealers, that they're capturing that battery that not good for the car, but again, good for a second life application, that they are internally handling it and making sure it finds its way to an appropriate second life application, which is in contrast to many of the brand name automotive dealer or automotive companies, which right now are actually sending batteries straight to recyclers, even though they might be really good for second life applications. But that Colorado could explicitly pursue more of these types of partnerships with the vehicle OEMs operating in the state. One example would be battery energy storage projects developed by Colorado utilities that they could really benefit from, something like a lot of standardized batteries coming out of one vehicle class, that internally the automotive company, because they might have all the service records, might have enough of the history that they could certify all of their batteries as being good for a Colorado utility project. That's also a good thing because, like I said, batteries are heavy, and moving them around to test and validate them costs a lot of money. And so as a result, it cuts into the potential profit or value associated with repurposing them because they cost more in the end. Okay, another option, again, to mandate some sort of labeling, something simple like a QR code on the batteries would help support lifetime tracking opportunities. So again, thinking one of the main challenges is, how do you know where a battery's been, how it's been stored? But so QR code labeling could give a tracking scheme that would support that lifetime tracking and could help further support product stewardship scheme or testing and validation activities. Could be helpful in a lot of different contexts. There are certainly different challenges associated with each of these different recommendations. And again, the text that will go into the updated ISWMP will have a lot more of the explanation behind the different types of challenges with the different options here. And is that our last slide, or do we have one more, Franny? Last one? Okay.
That is your last one.
All right, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Travis. Thank you, Eli. Thank you, Elizabeth. Now we'll briefly touch on waste diversion section of the report. There are 3 areas here that we identified as key target areas to help increase diversion across the state. As the first activity in this plan development and update is looking at the 2016 progress and where goals and recommendations have been implemented, partially implemented, or not yet implemented. So we consolidated those and did a review to see where we're at today. And here's a brief summary of some areas that we've been working on and where there's opportunity. Expanding upon that second column that looked at partially implemented or ongoing, you can see here a timeline of some activities that have been enacted or implemented since 2016. And so an example is the right to repair expansion, the establishment of the Colorado Circular Communities Enterprise Fund, which is helping provide technical assistance to communities across Colorado that are interested in waste aversion and diversion, helping implement those programs. Then also the passing of the extended producer responsibility, which will help increase recycling access for residents across the state as well. And then also a series of plans and studies that we also reviewed and compiled for this process, so that we're not ignoring the opportunities, the recommendations that have already been identified, but just honing in on where there's some really key target areas for the next 10 years. Of course, extended producer responsibility will impact recommendations that were presented in 2016, as well as those that are in consideration for the plan update. And so that's where for this activity, we're looking at the recommendations that kind of outside or complement the scope of EPR, so that we're not being redundant to what's already underway and will be finalized in 2026 under the Circular Action Alliance. As a refresher, once launched, this program will provide guidance to the state and local communities on how to increase that recycling access and also help with funding to expand recycling infrastructure and increase collection services as well. And so again, we're looking at recommendations here that complement EPR and also expand upon it and are outside of the scope. We had several meetings that helped us come to the conclusion for our key topic areas. And so in this first meeting, it was very broad in conversation where we wanted to hear from attendees on where they're seeing successes and where there are still opportunities for waste aversion and diversion, and looking at both the material subject or material matter, so that being organics, construction materials, reuse, etc., as well as the needs for strategies or how to address barriers such as funding, policies that can be expanded or implemented, and then overall education and behavior change as well. Meeting 2 was hosted in person in Denver. And so here we had 2 facilitated group activities approaches, infrastructure, funding, and policy. And so what type of policies are most helpful in the state? What funding could be expanded to help recycling and increase waste aversion and overall prevention of waste, and then also the infrastructure gaps and looking at those focus areas, and then looking at material categories. So within construction and demolition materials, within organics, within comprehensive recycling, what are the needs? Is it mostly looking at funding, infrastructure, or policy, etc.? Meeting 3 went back to a virtual discussion where we did an in-depth review of the recommendations that have thus been presented in those plans that I referenced in those earlier slides. So looking at that comprehensive list of recommendations, which are the ones that attendees wanted us to lean into, expand upon, and really emphasize as key priorities. Because it's a long list of recommendations, and for this update, we want to really focus on what's going to increase the most diversion in the state, and also speaks to the interests of those in our community. Meeting 4 presented our findings around the high priority recommendations in those 3 subject matters, that being organics, construction, demolition, and then comprehensive recycling. And so this meeting was hosted in Grand Junction, and we asked, 1, are these key priority recommendations aligned with the discussions we've had to date? And how can we ensure that these recommendations are complemented with paired policy suggestions or strategies that will help the communities not only in the Front Range but also across the state? So what I really acknowledging where there are infrastructure gaps, where we need more data to help with these findings. And then that's segue to the criteria for recommendation selection, where we wanted to identify the key areas that have lower barriers to applying them statewide, so not specific to the Front Range, Western Slope, but really can be attainable across the state, of course, acknowledging the varied access that we have currently or ways to go about that. Proven success, whether already in communities in Colorado or in other states. Potential for high diversion impact, so looking also at that statewide goal, and then also incorporating that feedback from those stakeholders. So here we have the high priority waste diversion recommendations. 1 is looking at organics. Then the first and foremost is imposing a landfill ban for yard waste. It was acknowledged that an overall interest in expanding diversion of not just yard waste is of interest. So this being food scraps and other organics, and that will be acknowledged in the plan. However, we're building a pathway for increasing diversion, and that's where we're starting off with that first viewpoint or stepping stone of looking at that yard waste, and we speak to how that can be implemented in the plan as well. Another component that is paired with that is promoting the end market use of finished compost. So this goes hand in hand, and so as we increase diversion, how can we make sure that we're creating robust markets for these materials that really helps the overall success of that organics infrastructure and its economy? So not just looking at diversion, but also looking at how we're supporting those that are processing the materials and distributing it as finished compost, whether for agricultural purposes or municipal projects, etc. And we speak to that more in the plan. Next is looking at construction and demolition recommendations. There's also the interest of prioritizing the recovery of untreated clean wood. There are other materials that can be high target materials that can be source separated at construction and demolition sites, and we're not ignoring that as well. But we have acknowledged that untreated clean wood does have a market in Colorado and has a high impact opportunity. And there are case studies of proven success in other states, as well as in Colorado, where there are communities that are already prioritizing the recovery of this material. Hand in hand with that, we're also looking at encouraging local governments to adopt ordinances such as incentivizing deconstruction projects, which emphasizes source separation of those materials for recycling or for reuse rather over demolition, where demolition usually does not end up with materials that can be recycled easily. And or see construction and demolition recycling requirements. This could be encouraging construction projects to have a plan that notes which materials will be generated on site and how they're planning to recycle them if possible, just to help those projects get started and be thinking about where those materials will go. And then that also will help with data for those municipalities to understand what materials are being generated in projects in their community. Then looking at comprehensive recycling, we have included a recommendation to conduct a statewide waste characterization study, since that does help with the further analysis of where there are high generation materials that could be source separated and sent for recycling, or where there's materials that are generated in high volume and could also be paired with infrastructure development and infrastructure funding for those recycling projects. Then also looking at equal space ordinances to ensure that new developments have adequate space for recycling. This comes up time and time again, where new buildings just do not plan for the source separation of materials. And this can help reduce barriers, those initial barriers to entry for recycling. And then another area is looking at statewide reporting requirements. There have been many municipality communities across Colorado that have acknowledged they would like to see something around hauler licensing or hauling requirements, so that they have better understanding of where material is flowing in the state and where everyone has equal understanding and access to recycling services as well as much as possible. And so we're exploring more of what that could look like and where there could be potential statewide reporting requirements that help statewide goals as well as local community goals for understanding where material is flowing, where it's going, and where we can be helping our service providers, that being material recovery facilities, haulers, or our residents. That's a very brief summary of the recommendations. This is a short list within each of these categories. There are acknowledgements to the recommendations that can be paired with this. But again, the emphasis here and the focus here was to look at the next 10 years and where we can help increase our statewide diversion rate currently, where we're at, and where there's the proven success and impact. That is the summary of the waste recommendations. We are more than happy to take a question now if there are any. This meeting has been recorded, and so we can share it widely for others that may not have been able to join us today. And then there will also be that public comment period where we highly encourage folks to share their thoughts and anything we may have missed in this process. I appreciate everyone's time today. Are there any questions or comments from the team? Rachel, I see you have a hand raised.
I do. Thank you for this very comprehensive presentation and all the research that went into this. It's really awesome. My question, I think, is for David. I'm curious, so many interesting policy recommendations in this. Do you have any idea what next steps would happen after this has gone to CDPHE? I presume it's CDPHE that adopts it, or does it have to go to the legislature for approval as a plan? And then after the full plan has been approved, is there potential for the department to pursue any of these policies, or would that just be a legislator hopefully picking something up and running with some of the ideas that are in here?
I could not figure out how to unmute myself. So David Snap, CDPHE. great questions. Let me see if I can answer them. So we, we'll go through our legislative folks and the governor's office since there are policy recommendations in this, and they're just recommendations. And so, we'll have that all reviewed and make sure that everybody's fine with that, internally before the document's finalized. And we've added in some of that review time to this document. There's always an opportunity that the department could, or the governor's office might see something, or someone in the executive branch could see something that is a policy recommendation that they would want to have adopted. And then clearly, there were things that some of the actions were taken, during the last revision or the 2016 update. Some things that we did administratively, then there's been things that clearly the legislature has taken up, by people getting their ear and requesting those policies. And so those things have also been acted on. So it's kind of a combination of anything could really happen.
Great, thank you, Rachel. I don't believe there will be any more questions, but this has been recorded, and we are happy to share the recording widely for folks that were not able to join today. All right, with that, have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.